Welcome back to the Learn English podcast, the podcast teaching English in context so you can learn naturally. My name is Dr. C. I'm a TESOL certified English teacher, and I teach English online to students who are learning it as a second language. On today's episode, I want to talk about a unique part of American culture, and that is changing our clocks. Yesterday was the day that we actually moved our clocks forward an hour. And this change occurs twice per year. Once per year, we move them back, and then another time, we move them forward. It wasn't until I started giving lessons online to people who live in other countries that I learned this time change does not occur all across the globe. Because of that, I really want to discuss it today. I'm going to talk about why the time change occurs, what the history of it is here in the United States, and what the potential future of this time change might be. So, with that, let's begin. With our time change yesterday, we are officially on daylight savings time here in the United States. Daylight saving time is the time period from March until November when it gets dark later here in the United States. That means that the sun goes down later and later. And where I am during the summer months, the sun goes down around 8:30, maybe 9 o'clock at the latest. Now, this is different from standard time, which is the time that we use during the winter months. In November, we move our clocks back by an hour, which means that it gets dark earlier and earlier. And again, where I am, that means the sun goes down around 3:30 or maybe 4:30, sometime in that range. The history of daylight savings time goes back to 1700s. In 1784, Benjamin Franklin first proposed the idea of this change in time. If you don't know who Benjamin Franklin is, he was one of the founding fathers, as we would say, of the United States. He's one of the people who helped during the Revolution time and was one of the people who helped build the nation after we separated from the British. He came up with this concept of daylight saving time, but it wasn't very popular and people didn't actually do it. It wasn't until actually World War One when the United States implemented this. During World War One in 1916, the Germans implemented this daylight saving time as a way to save fuel during the war. Other European countries did as well. And in 1918, the United States joined this effort and moved the clocks into this daylight savings time. Now, the idea was that because it got darker later, people used less fuel to light their house during the late afternoon, nighttime, and that would save fuel overall for the country. Now, this daylight saving continued, but in 1919, after the war ended, people wanted to go back to the standard time, and Congress repealed their legislation, and everything went back to normal, as we would say. Everything went back to standard time. World War One was followed by World War Two in the 1930s and 1940s, and the United States eventually did join World War Two. Now, just like what happened with the previous war, there came a time period when it was thought that Americans should change the clocks again to save fuel, to help with the war effort. In 1942, then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued a proclamation declaring wartime. Now, this is kind of a funny play on words. It was war and it was dealing with a time change, so it was called wartime. And that sent the message that this time change, moving the clocks again, was really to try to help with the war effort and conserve fuel. Just like with World War One, when World War Two ended, the clocks went back and went off wartime, but not everywhere. What happened was certain states and certain areas kept wartime while others went back to standard time. This became very confusing. It really became a mess because you could travel from one city to another and have different time. And that was very confusing. That is not a very good way to be efficient or to run a country when you have all of these different times going on across the United States. Congress realized they needed to act, and in 1966, they passed the Uniform Time Act. What this did was that it regulated daylight saving time. There were certain dates when everybody would flip over to daylight saving time, and then again, another certain date when everybody would go back to standard time. There was no more of this patchwork areas of some people being on one time and some being on another. However, it did allow certain states to opt out. Not every state had to join this Uniform Time Act. Now, although this Uniform Time Act in 1966 was supposed to pretty much settle the debate and make the time in the United States more uniform, there have been a lot of changes that have occurred since then. First was in the 1970s during something called the energy crisis. There was a shortage of energy here in the United States, and energy prices went through the roof, we would say. They got incredibly expensive. People could not get gasoline at gas stations, and it was just a crisis. What happened was that in 1973, Congress passed the Year Round Daylight Saving Time Act. This meant that we no longer changed the clocks backwards and forwards, but stayed at daylight saving time so that the sun went down later, again with this idea of saving energy. Now, what happened was people hated it. It was extremely unpopular. It messed with school schedules. Farmers who had to get up early hated it. People said it messed with their sleep schedule during the winter. And less than a year after it was implemented, Congress got rid of this whole act. In 1986, Congress again changed it by extending the time that we observe daylight savings time for 2 more weeks. And in 2005, they extended it yet again. This means that daylight saving time is now the majority of the months here in the United States. It's for 7 months out of the year. And then standard time is the remaining 5 months out of the year. As to when we change our clocks, it always follows a set schedule. We move the clocks forward, which means that we start daylight saving time the second Sunday of March, and we move the clocks back the first Sunday of November. This leads to a little idiom, a phrase that we say here in the United States, and that is fall back, spring forward. Fall back means that you are falling backwards, but in this case, it's referring to the season. Since we move our clocks in November, it is the fall season, the autumn season, and our clocks move backwards by 1 hour. In the springtime, which is in March, we move the clocks forward by 1 hour, which is where we get spring forward. Now, spring forward usually means jump forward, but again, referring to the season and what happens with the clocks. And it's a good little idiom, a good little saying to help you remember which direction you're moving the clocks and when. Fall back, spring forward. Move the clocks back in November and move the clocks forward in March. Now, even though we change the clocks twice per year here in the United States, this is actually an extremely unpopular thing that we do. Most Americans do not like the fact that we change our clocks twice per year, and there are a number of reasons. First is this whole idea about daylight saving time leading to energy savings. There have been studies that have shown that the amount of energy that is saved during daylight saving time is very minimal. Other studies have shown that it doesn't exist at all, that there is no energy saving. It's very controversial whether this actually has any impact on fuel consumption at all. Another problem is that some people just don't like when the sun stays out very late. They say that it changes their sleep schedule and it makes it hard for them to fall asleep. And there's also the immediate effect right after we change our clocks. In the days after the time change, people have reported that they have trouble sleeping because the clocks change, it impacts their circadian rhythm. Now, the circadian rhythm is the internal clock we have that our body tells us when to go to sleep and when to wake up. And moving the clocks changes this and impacts people's circadian rhythm. People report being more tired right after the time change, and studies have shown that this has led to an increase in accidents at work and also an increase in car accidents. People might not be fully alert, they might not be well rested, and therefore they're more likely to get into accidents. There's also been studies that have shown that the time change impacts people's health. Some studies have shown that there's a spike in the death rate in the days after a time change because people have more heart attacks and strokes, although the correlation or what's causing this is still a little bit debated. Of course, there's also the risk of not knowing that the time change is occurring. I definitely have worked with people who've shown up to work late because they didn't know that the time changed. And that's always a concern. You have to make sure you're aware of when the time is changing because if you miss it, you can be late for an event or for work the next day. And that's another part that can cause some anxiety and can cause some frustration for people during the time change. It's also important to remember that because there was that opt-out period of the original Uniform Time Act, that some states and some territories of the United States actually do not follow daylight savings time and don't change their clocks. For example, Hawaii and Arizona are two states within the United States that do not change the clocks. This means when everybody else goes to daylight saving time, they do not, which can make things confusing if you're traveling to or from Arizona or Hawaii. There's also a number of US territories that do not follow daylight saving time. These are not official states, but they're territories that are owned by the United States and are part of the United States. These territories that do not change their clocks are America Samoa, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Again, that can make it a little confusing logistically if you're traveling from the mainland United States to one of these places or vice versa. Because polls have consistently shown that the majority of Americans want to get rid of the time change, there have been ideas that have been proposed. For example, in California, we actually voted to get rid of the time change, but we couldn't do it. Now, the reason is that even though the people of California voted and agreed to get rid of the time change, this law had to get approved by the federal government and it just never happened. So even though we voted for it, it got sent to Washington, D.C., and it just kind of stopped there. They never approved it, and we still do the time change. There was also federally in Congress a bill that was proposed by the senators to get rid of the time change. It seemed like the biggest step forward at the time, but again, the way Congress works meant that nothing actually happened. If you don't know, United States Congress is split into two different houses. The first is the Senate, and the second is the House of Representatives. One of the houses can propose a bill and pass it, but then it gets sent to the other house to also pass it. The Senate passed the bill to get rid of the time change, but then when it got sent to the House of Representatives, again, it just stopped, and that meant that nothing changed and the time change continues. At the time of this recording, which is March of 2024, we are still doing the time change. Like I said, yesterday was the day that we changed the clocks because it was Sunday. I don't know in the future if it's going to change. Obviously, people of California wanted it to change, and that's where I live, and senators have proposed changing it, but I don't know if it's going to happen. A final note about this time period that we're in right now, now that we changed the clocks forward, the official name is Daylight Saving Time. Daylight Saving Time, singular, no S on saving. That is the official name in that Uniform Time Act from 1966. However, you will almost hear everyone say daylight savings time. If you talk to them, when you hear people talking about the time change, you will see it on news reports and social media. People will say it. So if you hear that, it's accepted, even though that's not the official name. People will say daylight savings time or daylight saving time means the same thing. The abbreviation for daylight saving time is DST, and standard time is just ST, and that changes depending on where you are. So, for example, I am in California, that is on the Pacific coast, that is in the Pacific time zone. So, during the summer months from March to November, our time is P for Pacific, and then DT for Pacific Daylight Time. During the winter months from November to March, we are PST, which is Pacific Standard Time. Again, it changes depending on where you are in the United States, but those are the letters we use: D for daylight and S for standard. Daylight goes with the summer, S goes with the winter, which is a little bit weird. I hope that you liked this episode. I hope you learned a little bit about the history of the time change here in the United States and why we are still doing it. A reminder that if you have not looked at the description of this episode, please do so. There is a list of vocabulary words in the description of this episode and in our previous episodes. I create this list of words and phrases that I use during the episode so you can refer back to it and so that you can take these words or phrases and add them to your vocabulary learning system. If there's anything that's new to you, if there's anything that you haven't seen or heard before, take these words or phrases that are new and add them to Anki, to Link, to your flashcards, to your gold list, whatever system it is that you are using. Add them to that list so that you can start learning them and using them yourself. That's really the goal of this podcast. We're trying to improve your listening comprehension, your vocabulary, and your fluency when you speak in English. If this episode helped you, if this podcast is helping you in general, please leave a rating on whatever app you are using to listen to this podcast on. I would really appreciate your support, and that would mean a lot to me. If you don't want to do that, it's okay. Just tell a friend, tell a family member, tell someone how awesome this podcast is and how much it is helping you on your English journey. If you have listened till the end, I want to thank you for your support. I want to tell you that I really appreciate it and I am grateful to be able to help you with your English. A reminder that you can follow us on social media at Learn English Pod. The website is learnenglishpod.com. And if you haven't, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss our next episode when it comes out next week. Until then, keep learning English.